Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison's away this week. Delighted to have my colleague, friend Carson Kelly with us again today's program for our week-long series on the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies and the team of researchers working there. So good morning, Carson. Great to be back with you again today.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much. It's nice to see you. Happy Wednesday. As Tom mentioned, we're here this week to talk about the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to share a bit about myself and Compassion 2.0 for those of you who aren't familiar. My name is Carson Kelly, and I'm the founder of Compassion 2.0. Compassion 2.0 is a collection of professionals who are attempting to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that is both based on scientifically validated practices and interventions, and that can also be measured. We do this through the development of compassionate and flourishing frameworks via product development and organizational architecture. Community consists of organizational developers and leaders, product developers, neuroscientists and behavioral scientists, medical doctors, UX, UI designers, entrepreneurs, VCs, and more. You can learn more about us at compassion2.com. As mentioned, we are continuing our week of a deep dive into the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies, or IACS for short. IACS is an independent neuroscience lab located in Santa Monica, California, and was founded by Dr. Nico Regente. From their website, they say, founded in 2019, the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies is a 501c3 research laboratory using immersive, experiential technology, neuromodulation, neurofeedback, and altered states to study consciousness. Specifically, our aim is to precisely capture, model, and provide an at-will instantiation of discrete states of consciousness that beget positive behavioral outcomes. Current focus is on fostering meditative and entheogenic experiences. Today, I am joined by Dr. Felix Scholler, who is a senior researcher at the IACS, and he has been doing a large deep dive on aesthetic chills. So today we're going to be exploring that with him. So welcome, Felix. It's nice to see you. And yeah, nice to see you today.
Thank you, Carson. Hello.
So just wanted to take a moment and ask you to just give the audience just a bit of background about yourself. Just, it doesn't have to be lengthy, but just how did you get involved in this work, and what motivates you about it?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Felix. I'm a senior research scientist at the IACS, where I'm specifically working on aesthetic chills, so the feeling of cold down your spine when you listen to music, and examining the potential benefits of chills for depressed moods and other psychopathologies. And I've been working on the subject for 10 years, initially as a way of understanding the effect of stories on human emotions. And I figured if we can understand chills, that would be, or the scenes that give you chills in movies, it would be a good start to understand movies and the effect they can have on us and our lives and our culture.
Very cool. So tell us a little bit more, just as an overview and introduction for those of us who are curious about aesthetic chills. Like what exactly does that mean? Specifically, how are you studying it? Just give us an overview in terms of how you're going about this work.
Yeah, so originally chills is the sensation associated to shivers, and shivers are small tremors of skeletal muscles that produce heat in order for the body to maintain its core temperature stable. So it's what we call the thermoregulatory mechanism. So whenever you feel cold to a certain degree, the body will activate this response to be able to maintain its internal temperature within sort of safe ranges, right? So that all of the other organs can perform their function. In humans and other primates like chimpanzees, these sort of shivers and chills response can sometimes occur independently of any changes in temperature. So, before I speak specifically about this, I should mention two things. First, that sometimes chills and shivers are accompanied by goosebumps, which is also a thermoregulatory mechanism that creates kind of like a second layer of skin that minimizes the heat loss. So again, as a way of maintaining the core temperature, stable. And chills and shivers also occur in the cases of fevers, because the heat is a way to slow down the rate of pathogen growth. So if you have an invasion of the body by a virus or something, it's kind of adaptive to increase the body temperature because it will make it harder for the virus to proliferate. So as I said, in humans and other primates, this sort of response can occur independently of any changes in temperature or in any sort of pathogen invasion. And this we called aesthetic chills to distinguish from sort of thermoregulatory chills. And from a point of view of neuroscience, it's really interesting because the moments we can really like study them rigorously in the way that the type of stimuli that trigger the chills are quite distinct. So we can really look into, the sort of the things that give you chills, the situations, the objects. So we know that in humans, for example, it's most likely music or films, or some people have them during social interactions as well and religious rituals. So we can talk more about the type of things that give people chills. But then, it's also really good because people can sort of report them consciously. So they know whether they have chills or not. There's no uncertainty about this. And it's a universal response. So, it's been observed across cultures. Even though the stimuli that may generate them may not be universal, the response in itself is universal. And finally, there are things we can measure in the laboratory because heat is kind of the physical quantity by excellence, and it's really amenable to scientific measure. So, all of this makes it a really interesting object of study for neuroscience with, as I hope we can discuss today, some very interesting potential for clinical applications as well.
Yeah, so many things to unpack there. The first of which is, and I've only, heard you give this discussion in various formats several times, and yet just now I had, I'm going to try to avoid the pun of chills, but I just had a realization that so there's the thermoregulatory function of chills versus the aesthetic chills, of course, which is you're studying the aesthetic chills. Is the physical reaction, forgive me, I think you were just speaking to this, but maybe I didn't grok this. Is the physical reaction identical, but just different deployments? So one is to regulate in the sense of fighting off pathogens, and another is in response to some sort of stimuli. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I think it's never been demonstrated empirically. Nobody has really taken the pain to devise an experiment where they induce thermoregulatory chills and aesthetic chills and compare how the physiological signature, align. So if, I was a pure scientist, empiricist, I would say, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, no worries. Well, it sounds like a new line of research, and if you want, I'll take care of that. Just let me know. That was a joke. Anyway, moving on. So tell me a little bit more about the kinds of stimuli that the aesthetic chills that you're seeing. Unpack that for us too.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been quite a journey, asking people for 10 years the stuff that give them chills. And it's always something very interesting because it's an intimate event, right? So I don't know the type of chills the type of things that give you chills, Carson, or or the other people on this podcast. And once we start talking about it, it's very interesting. It's a way of learning about other people really fast, about what's really important to them, we find sometimes it's really surprising. And there's this interesting thing too, that there's like positive chills and negative chills, right? So people also report chills, not just when they listen to beautiful music, but when they can be really scared. And it's interesting that some people will spontaneously mention negative chills as opposed to other people will mention positive chills. That's also an indication of the people. But at any rate, so the type of so what we've done in order to identify in a kind of rigorous way what gives chills to people is we built this algorithm that can span through YouTube networks and detect comments where people mention goosebumps, chills, shivers, cold down the spine, and then retrieve these videos and put them in a database, which we can then, use to expose thousands of subjects and validate which are the videos that are most likely to give chills beyond just kind of this measure in the wild on YouTube of the chills mentioned. And it boils down really to three categories, at least using this technique. The videos that we find are mostly music, and usually it's religious music and choirs. The second type of category is motivational speeches, where you have like a speaker, very emotional speaker who is kind of talking to you about how you should live your life with this like heroic music. And the third one are movie scenes that usually depict a very empathic situation. So we have one that maybe we can show afterwards to give people a sense of these films. But in my research, a lot of the early work that I've been doing is showing that chills is not solely happening as a response to music, which is mostly where it's studied in neuroscience. I think most of the 50 articles on chills are concern music. There's a few exceptions about poetry by a German group in Frankfurt. But so also people experience chills in response to science, especially physicists and mathematicians, when they manage to solve a problem or understand a concept that has huge implications for their sort of model of reality, then they report experiencing chills. Or mathematicians, when they work on a problem and they get excited, they can also experience chills. And then in religious contexts, there's also a lot of mention of chills. And there's interesting chills in that regard. And we've actually just started a study here on a subject who can elicit chills by engaging in these like deep religious meditations. And he can sustain chills for 30 minutes. So we're interested in like characterizing the neurophysiology of that event. But in general, yeah, this like art, science, and religions are things sort of these cultural activities of the human is trigger chills. And then specifically when it comes down to modern usage of digital technology, the stuff that we see empirically are this music, speech, and films.
Out of curiosity, the subject that you just mentioned, is that person a monastic?
No, he's a software engineer in San Francisco.
Got it. That's interesting. But wow, fascinating. 30 minutes.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting.
Very interesting. Out of curiosity as well, what percentage, just anecdotally, I don't know if you studied this formally, but what percentage of people report negative chills versus positive chills? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, from my experience, it's pretty rare, but it happens. Just like sampling my own experience, I think it would be maybe 10%. And yeah, it's interesting. Usually, yeah, I've had people who have a lot of negative chills come to me and like trying to understand why, because they don't really understand. And yeah, I guess it depends. It really depends on your life experience, right?
Interesting. It's also interesting too to me to I put the chillsdb.com URL into the webinar chat for everybody so they can go get a sense of the website. But what's interesting too is on the music. that it's largely around, as you said, kind of choral or spiritual, religious. And you're not seeing I should ask, are you seeing as much in the sense of pop music, for instance, like people who are enjoying, say, Taylor Swift, are they reporting chills in that context?
Yeah, there's also some pop music that showed up. Lana Del Rey, for example, and a few. Even the most successful stimulus in our database is rendition of the Alleluia song by Leonard Cohen in a mass choir. And to some extent, you could consider that kind of pop music, I guess, in the sense that it's like more popular than the Miserere from Allegri, which is another song that people probably don't know about. But it's still religious, right? The whole Alleluia thing. So there may be something about this sort of reverence, towards the idea of something so much larger than ourselves that is really good at triggering this chills response.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I wonder, and by the way, I don't mean to be the host hog here. So Tom, at any point in time, please jump in. One thing that does come to mind are principles of awe. And I know that, and I wonder, what the Venn diagram is of chills and awe. And I'm thinking specifically of large scale churches, particularly that you'd see in Europe, the big, massive structures, or you go in and just be overwhelmed by their size. And as I understand it, principles of awe, one of the concepts is to feel very small, right? Is in the sense of you're overwhelmed by something much larger than you, be it beauty or a vista, or in this example, like a church, a magnificence of a beautiful church. I wonder, have you explored that at all, or is there any overlap there? Or
yeah, I mean, it's kind of striking, right? That this religious element that, first of all, if you look at the musical pieces that trigger chills, a lot of them are, religious in nature, even though people may not be aware of it. So it's almost like they're getting the sort of religious sentiment without the ideology. And then the chills occur in religious contexts, in all sorts of cultures. So there's some anthropological studies in Pentecostalist in the US, some also sort of voodoo practices in Cuban rituals. I know there's also work in sort of like older cultures. And yeah, there's this like religious element, which is, kind of interesting. The way I think about it currently is kind of, when you think about the chills and the religious music, I think of maybe chills are a form of like religious device that, maybe they're a way of inducing certain states that make you, that I don't know, that, the church could be interested in, for example.
Yeah, or naturally have uncovered. And what's fascinating too, and we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, maybe you and I can talk at some point, but is this notion of a religiosity in music relative to, say, other music that doesn't have that quality, and what does that quality mean? And is that quality then tied to kind of a fundamental sense of self and your place in the world, and those things that religion tends to offer to people, giving an ontological answer, so to speak. I wonder if there's some sort of sense about that anyway, fascinating, really fascinating.
Yeah. I think it's what in philosophy they call the sublime, right? Which speaks to the limits of cognition and the limits of thinking.
Right.
And I think what these kind of chill stimuli, the way they can, I think there's different ways, right? There's one way that's kind of like easy to understand from like an information theoretic perspective, where I know people have chills when they report. They use chills kind of a criterion for the evidence of the existence of God. So I've had numerous reports of religious subjects who say, oh yeah, for me, chills is the proof that God exists. And when I get the chills, I feel that, God is there and he's there's probably some, like it's paying attention to me or something. So there's that. It's similar to in music. Some people sometimes say, oh yeah, if I have chills or movies, if I have chills, it means it's a good film, or it's a, it's a good piece of music. So it's kind of like a confirmation bias, with this sort of like self-reinforcing through bodily signal of sorts that acquires this kind of objectivity, because chills are kind of surprising, right? When they're almost something that occurs to you. So it's like if they're occurring to you, then in a way that must be true. The way that the external world is something that's occurring to you, and
Right.
you have control over it or limit it to some extent. So there's a sense of reality there that this is real, this is true, And I think so. I think yeah, it's so we've devised kind of computational models of chills, relating them to this construct with Leonid Perlovsky that we've been working on, the sort of knowledge instinct, or which in sort of more general terms you could call it learning, or you could call it curiosity, which is something that we don't understand that well, but still there's a considerable amount of work on the topic. And together with Leonid, we've been conceptualizing chills as satisfaction or dissatisfaction of curiosity, or knowledge instinct. So essentially an event where you reach the limits of your understanding, whether in a positive way or a negative way. So, and in a way, you could think about chills in a religious context, in the way that Kant used to think about the sublime, which is by challenging our cognition and presenting objects that are way beyond what we can think or imagine, it's also reinforcing it. And it's also a testimony to the fact that we can understand things in the first place. There's beautiful passages in Kant where he talks about the sublime, saying that this challenge to cognition is also an acknowledgement of cognition itself. And maybe that's part of this sort of reverence feeling that is in many ways instrumentalized by the church, or religious authorities, and sort of engineered through architecture, music, and stories.
I'm sorry, just as an aside, were you speaking about Kant, Immanuel
Yeah.
Kant? Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Just
Tom?
to jump in real quick,
please.
there's a lot of activity in the chat that's talking about making distinctions between the chills. So folks are talking about spiritual chills, they're talking about physical chills, they're talking about emotional response to content. And I'm wondering, in your research, if you've made any kind of distinctions between how a human is responding to chills.
Yeah. So I think distinctions exist relative to goals. We were discussing that a bit before the podcast, but I think there are fundamental distinctions between, for example, the type of things that cause the event, right? So we could distinguish between the thermoregulatory chills and then the aesthetic chills. I think that's a pretty basic, distinction to make, that it's difficult to have a conversation of any degree of accuracy if we don't distinguish between this, right? Then within the category of aesthetic chills, you can make a distinction between positive and negative chills, right? So chills have positive valence and negative valence, which you can easily connect to mechanisms of approach and avoidance in behavioral science. So positive chills are things that you'd like to move towards, and negative chills would be things that you would want to retrieve yourself from. And then we can make distinctions in positive chills depending on the type of things that elicit them. So I think for me, the most useful distinctions are the three categories of art, science, and religion. And then there may be other things. And I would actually, like most, a lot of sociologists and anthropologists, count these mass secular events as the contemporary version of old religious gatherings. So if we think about the chills in the context of football stadium, for example, where everybody's kind of doing the same thing at the same time and sort of communing around the sort of event. A lot of sociologists and anthropologists describe that as the modern secular version of older religious rituals. So I would count this kind of mass chills as a case of religion, which etymologically means comes from the Latin religere, means to link together, right? And as a way of connecting and bonding with one another, other like very simple, predictable things. So I would distinguish between I guess like musical chills and then art, science, and religions as kind of three types of stimuli or behavior or cultural artifacts that can trigger chills. But in general, I would sort of account for all of the positive and negative chills in light of humans' vital need for cognition and meaning. So I think all of these events, whether positive or negative, they correspond to a null derivative in the function that describes knowledge acquisition. So null derivatives are mathematical events where a function reaches a local maximum. And that's whether the maximum is positive or negative. So I don't know. These are the categories that I use. But I think, again, like categories depends on what you're trying to do and the goals you're trying to achieve. I don't think, definitions exist in the abstract. I think we do the best we can in order to make sense of the world so that we can meaningfully act upon it and act with it. So, I think whatever goal you're trying to achieve, then you will probably need different categories. Yeah. Sorry, I've been a bit long, but that's
No.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for me, I'm just thinking at a sort of a meta level. What's the utility of a chill, and whether I'm in nature or have a chill from a natural setting, or if I'm in a meditative state and I can feel my chi moving in my body and I get that chill, or I'm listening to music. In all of those situations at a sort of a meta level, they force me to just stop and pause.
Yeah.
And just become aware of, I'm a point and a wave.
That's a really good point. Yeah, so there's a group in Torino of Pietro Sarasso and a few other colleagues who have this very nice paper called Beauty and Stopping for Knowledge, where they have this idea that the chills and other aesthetic emotions in general, they're a sort of cognitive device that's kind of like forcing you in a situation that has a lot of, say, like information potential where you can learn a lot from it, either because it's threatening your survival or because, on the contrary, it could be very beneficial for you. At any rate, like a situation that has a lot of uncertainty associated to it, or where there's a potential to relieve a lot of uncertainty at a rate that's faster than expected. These aesthetic emotions like chills would force you to stop to acquire knowledge. Speaking to exactly what you just mentioned, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And they've been like pretty good at sort of demonstrating that empirically, showing that these sort of aesthetic emotions have all sorts of downstream effects on attention, memory, cognition, and people remember better these events. They are better at reasoning about these events, and their attention capabilities also are improved. So, if speaking about the function of chills in nature, one way of thinking about it is to say that they're a very basic organismic response to things that we should approach or avoid. So it's kind of like hijacking the higher cognitive functions when, let's say, you're engaged in a movie and So usually people, when they're engaged in a movie, they're pretty dissociated, right? It's kind of like a hypnotic process. And the chills is this sort of bodily event that's reorienting their attention towards specific events in the environment and saying, whatever you were doing before, like stop all of this, something is happening, and, you should pay attention to your surrounding and then, produce the adequate response, whether it's, approach it or avoid it. Kind of like similar to, one of the famous sort of, autonomous, sympathetic nervous responses of, you could have like, fight, flight, freeze, and then maybe frisson is one of them that people have, forgot or something. Yeah.
Really interesting. I wanted to, Tom, may I jump back in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Earlier in your discussion, you mentioned that there's universalities around chills, but the stimuli are very different depending on different cultures and so forth. I wondered if you'd be willing to unpack that a little bit, just based on what you've seen.
Yeah. Well, the only example that I can really think of are in the religious context. Yeah, I don't have a really good example of that because unfortunately that's not something I've been meaning to study. So the way I've been able to study, but the reason why we built the YouTube algorithm was to be able to study these intercultural differences as a way to also create bridges between cultures. But yeah, unfortunately, Google has changed its API. Before we were able to include other dictionaries than the English dictionary. So we got kind of stuck in English networks.
I see.
Before we could go to Indian networks or Chinese networks and used other alphabets and dictionaries. So I can't really speak to it, but I think it's something I will be working on, when I retire or something. Like really.
Cool.
Right now, yeah, I'm really focused on depression and, very specific populations, like, building machine learning model of what give chills to certain people, but, within the US, for example. So it doesn't really make sense for me to look at chills in Papua New Guinea, which I think would be tremendously interesting to study, and also study chills at different moments in a culture. Chills at different moments also in life, chills as you evolve through your life, the type of things that give you chills, like, because again, it's like an indication of the limits of your cognition. So you could expect that as cognition grows and develop, whether at the cultural scale or individual scale, the type of things that will elicit this response will also change.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, tell us then about the work that you're doing specifically. You said you were looking at depression within certain populations in the United States. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we've been really focusing on Southern California because that's where we're based. And so a lot of, the things I've been saying today, they really concern Southern California. Like all of these stimuli that we validated them in Southern California. So what we've been doing is, studying the effects of these chill stimuli on people diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So we found a number of things that are interesting. First, we found that so one thing that we do when we study chills is we look at people's emotions before and after they're exposed to the stimulus. And typically in psychology and neuroscience, when we think about emotion, we usually place them on an axis, like a diagram with two dimensions. And these would be the emotional valence and emotional arousal. And you can think of it as like the quality of the emotion and then the quantity of the emotion. So valence is whether the emotion is positive or negative. And then arousal is sort of the activation of the physiological system. So whether you're like more excited or more calm, if you will. And so you can then place all emotions on this two-dimensional axis. in kind of like a circle. It's called the circumplex model of emotion. And one thing that is very robust and that we found again and again and again every time we run a study is that when people experience the chills in response to a stimulus, they show this kind of emotional drift, like a positive emotional drift, where they tend to have higher arousal and higher valence than where they started. So it makes people feel good in a way. And they go in this like top right quadrant of positive valence and positive arousal. And this is true also of depressed subjects, which typically, are, characterized by, this difficulty in experiencing positive emotion. In fact, it's an interesting challenge in depression research because we're pretty good at like mitigating negative moods and negative emotions. Like we have all sorts of instruments in cognitive and behavioral therapy to help people understand how they can have like negative bias towards things and people. But when it comes to eliciting positive emotions, which is something we call positive affect exposure, there's not so many researchers that are interested in this, and it's actually a much harder task than eliciting negative emotions, which is something I remember I was taught also in film school, where it's much easier to make somebody cry or make somebody afraid with a movie than to make them laugh or have fun or experience positive emotions. It's much harder. And that's why like a lot of student films are usually about, either really bad, gross jokes or really pseudo scary stuff or disgusting things, because these are pretty easy to elicit emotions, but positive emotion is harder. But with the chills, we see that it creates this like positive drift, which, that's pretty amazing because then you can start training people to experience these positive emotions in their lives. And usually that's in three forms. Like, first of all, it's like anticipating future events, positive events. The second one is like savoring positive events, like when something good happens to you, really like stopping and enjoying the moment and savoring it. And then also remembering better positive events and depressed people, they struggle with all three of those and they tend to focus on the more negative things. So that in itself, I think is, already a very powerful, very interesting result because you can give them a sense of what it feels like to experience positive emotions. And then once you have that, you can use that as a standard to then build and have more and more of that in their lives. Then there's like more specific things around their sensitivity to reward and their maladaptive cognition, which is really sort of the work that we're doing now.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Paul Ekman and his daughter, Dr. Eve Ekman, and their Atlas of Emotions?
Yeah, Paul Ekman is the different faces of emotion, right?
Right, right.
I don't know about his daughter though.
Yeah, his daughter Eve has been collaborating with him over the last decade or so on his initial research on the Atlas of Emotions.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, is that the website?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the website before. It has really good design and explains to you about emotions. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, they've done some pretty groundbreaking work. The other question I was going to ask you around depression, Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia University has been doing a lot of work with primarily adolescents to reintroduce them to their spiritual core.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, she's been able to significantly reduce anxiety, depression, self-mutilation, suicide, increase academic performance through a curriculum of having the students get reacquainted with and revive their spiritual core.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Oh, that
wondering
sounds really interesting. I don't know. I don't know about it. So, what is its spiritual core in that context? What does it mean?
It's a recognition that there's a distinction between religion and spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
and that each of us are spiritual beings, and we have, when we're born, we come into this world with a spiritual core that can be activated in nature. It could be activated in meditation, any number of ways of connecting us to something larger than ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and I guess
Yeah.
people can find that in science too, through connection to the natural world, and this idea that through our mind we're able to understand the workings of nature, and so therefore there's kind of an acquaintance to it, or some form of connection.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know about her work, but the subjects that we are studying, who can experience this very intense religious chills, he speaks, to the fact that for him it's been very important in his life in dealing with anxiety and helping with self-regulation, and experience feelings of safety and so on, which is what is like driving me to study this. Is trying to understand, okay, is it really true that he's getting these effects and benefits? And then if it's true, then can we capture that and embody it in a device of sorts that can help people get access to the states that have a positive effect? Yeah, it's there's still like a lot of open questions, right? But yeah, it's interesting, this question of our emotion in relationship to kind of the world in general, right? And this kind of this big general emotions of the feeling of being alive, or the feeling of finding one's place in the world.
Mhm.
Outside of the discussion about chills specifically, I think there's a larger discussion about the type of positive emotions that can be the result of the human experience that we may not have the occasion to experience so often in our culture as it exists today, right? Because of the type of activities that we engage in most of the time and so on. And yeah, I mean, I remember I just visited Yosemite with my brother, and it was incredible, like seeing the strength of these waterfalls that are would crush anybody instantly, and then fall into the forest and destroy a whole forest to just make its way through down the valley. And there's a very special emotional life in response to this, which we don't live if we're remain in sort of like everyday situations of that most of us in the Western world are exposed to every day. And it's interesting how we can use technology to capture these internal states, and then allow us to re-access them later on. And one thing that's kind of driving my research too is the idea of synthetic emotions, the idea that there could be there probably are emotions that we haven't felt yet.
Mm.
Right? So these type of emotions of like the awe or the sublime, or they're rare emotions because you rarely reach the limits of your cognition. Otherwise, you wouldn't be functioning so well, right? If we were always kind of surprised by our environment in this like deep, profound way, it would mean that it would probably be a very challenging world to navigate. So you could understand why these are rare, but it's interesting to think about what could be an emotion that we haven't experienced yet, or an emotion that maybe doesn't exist in our culture. Going back to Carson's question about the chills across culture, it could be that there are actually maybe fundamental differences in chills between cultures, especially at different rates of development, right, or evolution. Like if you think about the chills of very early hominids cultures, they're probably very different from the type of chills that you have, in Los Angeles today. And if we were able to study these very early chills events of early hominids, then maybe we could create some form of modern equivalent that would have very powerful effects, and would I don't know, yeah, play a role as kind of a reminder of earlier form of human development.
Really very interesting idea. The question is, how much of these emotions, to your point, might be tied to almost say dying or being eaten by the big bad mammal, and there's those feelings that come forward within the range of say terror and fear and embodiment.
Yeah. And actually, I wanted to mention that before. So when you were asking about religious chills, I wanted to answer something related to the work of Ernst Becker, who's a historian and psychologist who wrote this famous book called The Denial of Death, which is an incredible book. And there's another one called The Birth of Meaning, where he speaks about the role of heroism in human culture and human life. And I'm not able to like formulate exactly what I want to say about this, but Ernst Becker, has this theory that the problem that that a lot of human behavior is actually motivated as a way of avoiding direct confrontation with death, in the way that sort of the early existential psychologists like Erich Fromm used to think about this, for example, as they looked at a lot of human behavior as defense against basic elements of the human condition, like dying, or even like births as well, you know or yeah, like separation, that's inherent to the loss, for example, of somebody close. And they looked at a lot of human behavior as a protection against these things that are inherent to the human conditions, but that we just are too painful for us to acknowledge. Like if we had to live our life thinking, no, but we're going to die, it would make it very challenging. And most people would be like, why would I do that if I'm going to die? Or why would I develop a friendship with you, Carson, if you're going to die one day? And what is this all for, right? And so he looked a lot at culture and myths, and specifically myths about heroism, as kind of the ultimate sort of denial of this elements of human existence and the human condition that we cannot escape from. And so there's a way in which you can also look at this sort of religious chills and the chills in stories as in regard to this, right, as a way of avoiding facing these things that are too painful to face. And in order to do that, we invent these stories with heroes who can do everything and who survive all the events. And even the music, when you look at the motivational speech, they have this heroic tone, really. But it's the framework of Ernst Becker is kind of complex, and it's like it's a whole framework on its own. So, but I can just like a quick thing about this, because sorry, I've been like it's not really clear what I mean, but let me try to be a bit more clear about what I mean. So there's this concept in psychiatry called primary states of consciousness, with the idea that with the emergence of human consciousness, there also appears the capacity to inhibit, short-term biological behavior, specifically related to sex and aggression, or love and hate, if you will, or sex and aggression. So, in order to build long-term systems and cultures, we need to be able to inhibit some basic biological drives. And in a large, and that's one way of thinking about consciousness, is that it's sort of like executive control over basic biological drives, right? And there's this, and so, in psychiatry, they call this secondary states of consciousness, as opposed to primary states of consciousness, which are states of consciousness where there is no such thing as the inhibition of, basic biological drives. And so all the animal is doing is responding to this environment, reacting to its environment, without introducing a buffer between perception and action, which also speaks to Tom's comment about, oh, it makes me want to stop and acquire knowledge. Like one of the basic model in cognitive science of cognition is as a buffer between perception and action. Like I see something, I think, and then I act. Pre-human animals don't have this buffer. They have just like closed reflex arcs or sort of perception action loops that can't really be stopped, right? And then if you present the right stimulus, you'll get the right response in a very predictable way. That's been, it's been well studied by ethology and people like Konrad Lorenz and Nikos Tinbergen and so on. So the idea of primary states of consciousness is also kind of reappearing today in the research on psychedelics as a way for accounting for the neurobiology of altered states of consciousness in psychedelics. Because in the original framework of Freud and then some of his students, the primary states of consciousness can also happen in humans when there is a catastrophic breakdown of the secondary defenses. So, you no longer inhibit these biological drives of aggression and sex. So they occur, for example, and the examples that Freud used for that purpose, and then later somebody like Silvano Arietti, for example, who was an Italo-American psychiatrist, or a specialist of schizophrenia and psychosis, is the way. So Silvano Arietti did a lot of work on studying primary states of consciousness as they occur in schizophrenia. And what typically happens is, so you have this breakdown of secondary defenses, and you start having so as an example of this type of behavior, they would use things like like early childhood cognition before the development of consciousness, or senility or dreams. Within dreams, you start also having this kind of like breakdown of defenses, and you have all this kind of weird imagery that show up that can be very violent, that can be very sexual in nature, and so on. But also, like psychotic decompensation, typically when people are exposed to very challenging life events, where they lose somebody very close to them, when there's like a birth of a child, when they're exposed to these, fundamentals of human experience that we tend to deny on an everyday basis, and they can no longer hold the defenses to protect themselves against these things that are too painful to experience. You can have this like psychotic, decompensation that leads to, full-blown psychotic episodes that manifest in various different forms. One of them is paranoia, where they are invaded by fear and panic and so on. And it's also something that can happen in war, and something that can happen in sects, where typically cult leaders, they will attack the secondary defenses by forcing people to, for example, fight with each other, or have sexual orgies and so on, as a way to break down the defenses and create some form of dependency towards the leader, and so on. It's something that, I don't know if you know the sect of I think his name is Ravesh, or this famous Indian guru in the Rajesh, I think. Let me find. Rajneesh, I think.
Rajneesh, yeah. Rajneesh, Bhagwan.
Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I could listen to you for
hours. I'm being too long, but
no, it's okay.
This speaks to like the theory of Ernst Becker on the denial of that. So in a way, you could, like, to summarize everything I said, but maybe these chill stimuli, and they provide us with a really good story about the human condition that is better than the one that nature is offering us and that culture is doing its best to
deny.
avoid and deny. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if it's just kind of hearing what Tom was speaking to in his experience and just some of the things. I just wonder if the chills are some sort of like roadmap or some sort of road sign, if you will, on like your embodiment and your connection to your ontological dependency upon the body. I don't know. I'm not, my words aren't quite here on that. One of the things too that I wanted to ask you about was the work you guys did on the maladaptive schema.
Yeah.
This is really fascinating. Could you just take a few moments and just tell the listeners about that project?
Yeah. So maladaptive schema are these instruments from cognitive and behavioral therapy that's used to describe a set of beliefs that develop in adaptation to dysfunctional early childhood experiences, typically things like neglect or abuse. And as a result to exposure to this difficult environment in childhood, subjects, develop this maladaptive view of the world and of themselves, where when they develop autonomy from the household, reveal themselves as deeply maladapted to everyday society. So typically there are things like they feel that they're a failure, no matter what I try, it will never work, or if people could see the real me, then they wouldn't like it. Things like you cannot trust other people, like mistrust schema, negativity schema, and so on. And so there's this set of schema. Originally, it's a tool that was developed to work with personality disorders, which are typically resistant to cognitive and behavioral therapy because they have this deep-seated schema. And cognitive and behavioral therapy is not good at dealing with the causes of the disorder. It just tries to deal with the symptoms, and once I deal with the symptoms, then the subject feels better. And so cognitive and behavioral therapy, early maladaptive schema was this instrument developed by Jeffrey Young as a way to connect cognitive and behavioral therapy with some form of psychoanalysis, looking at the origins of these maladaptive cognitions that are actually a really big problem in chronic depression. We've been struck by the connection between the content of the Chills videos and some of these maladaptive schemas, or their counterpart of adaptive schemas, because you also have instruments that measure the invert of the maladaptive schema. And specifically, when you look at the motivational speeches, for example, they seem to even almost like provide really strong evidence against the schema. So you can even think of it as in terms of kind of a blockbusters as a way for culture to maintain these kind of adaptive models of self, others, and the world. So we've been interested in first studying the effect of the chills on the schema. And we found in a study that was published in BMC Psychiatry that we were able to mitigate and deactivate maladaptive schema in depressed subjects using specific stimuli. So there's this stimulus-specific dimension that makes it very interesting, and suggests that potentially we could actually, given your schema profile, give you the right videos that would provide evidence against this kind of negative view of the world that you've developed in childhood and served you at that moment as an adaptation to a hostile environment, but is no longer serving you in an environment where you have your own autonomy and you're no longer dependent on caregivers for your survival. And we've been successful at that, and that was a really good step. But then the next step was using artificial intelligence and large language models to create clones of the existing stimuli that would target specific schema. And so, for example, one of the stimulus that is really good at triggering chills is the speech from Charlie Chaplin at the end of The Dictator. And what we've done is create a copy, clone of that speech that now speaks to a specific schema. So, for example, we tried with the schema of negativity, where people think, you can never be careful enough. Something bad is always around the corner to get you, or kind of like, the negativity schema. And so we changed the text, the content of the speech so that it targets the negativity schema. And then we had what's called a speech synthesis algorithm read the speech using Chaplin's voice with the same emotionality, and then exposed subjects like depressed. So this is in healthy subjects. A more recent study in healthy subject, we exposed 200 healthy subjects to two groups. One with the original clone and the other one with one with the original stimulus and one with the clone. And we found that not only were we able to elicit chills with the clone, which is really cool, and also elicit the emotional drift that I was talking about, but also deactivate their negativity schema, which typically takes a lot of time. Like, clinical trial on schema therapy for chronic depression, it's usually like 75 sessions of 50 minutes. So, there's a lot of questions about how long these effects would hold and so
Yeah, that would
on.
be my question is, how
That's what we're currently trying to do at the institute, is set up the like a longitudinal study where we expose subjects to the stimuli that are relative to their schema for 8 weeks, and then see how that actually affects their depression score. Because in that study, we didn't measure depression score. It doesn't make sense because it's just one exposure. But it's very promising, and it's amazing that it has the effect on the schema, and it triggers the chills. And it's just the beginning of what is possible with technology, right? It's just one step. But what I envision in the future is using this kind of technology to create almost like personalized movies that are working with your life's data.
right.
So instead of showing you James Bond doing this or that, we will show you and work with your life experience and your data to create the story that you need in order to overcome some of your like limiting beliefs or behaviors.
Yeah, brilliant. It's amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's just incredible.
Well,
Tom,
the work needs to be done, right? It's
no, I understand, but it's just to be able to vision the sense of like, this is where we go, even though that this is the journey. We're starting with our first steps, right? So the Chinese statement of 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step, and you guys have taken the first of the several steps, and it looks promising. It looks like there's a pathway there and potentiality for that journey to bear some fruit at some point. So it's awesome. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying, because it's also probably, I won't be the one of doing this. It will be like in decades from now. And, I think, it's like the first step towards something, much, much larger. And, I mean, the possibilities are incredible. Like if we could all, have this like, Netflix that works with our own data, that produces these films that we need to see in order to, become better and, overcome our limitations.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, just to unpack that just a little bit further, this notion of some sort of objective message, right? Because that's what I'm hearing is underneath this. It's this, I show up with my own maladaptive schema. I'm operating in the world with this deep, deep seated frame, belief, point of reference, response to a very difficult situation, whatever it is, or the reason I have it. And I see the world in this way. And then all of a sudden, this objectively separate entity, be it an actor or musician or whatever it might be, can come forward and starts to speak in, I keep getting reminded of Joseph Campbell somehow, I'm not sure, but just these larger meta narratives that can come back and say, actually, what you're holding is not correct. What you're holding is false. And it's this objective statement as to why. I think it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
That was beautiful how you opened something, because your background is all white, so it's kind of almost like opening
like an ethereal thing.
Yeah.
My window was open, and there's a person using a mower next door, so I don't know if the sound was coming through. So I just didn't expect that to happen. Tom, any thoughts so far? Because I have a couple
of what's showing up for me in this conversation is that, oftentimes we think of what does it mean to be human as we're just this physical body. And what I'm hearing in the conversation is a reminder that we are also a spiritual body, and a psychological, emotional body, and an energetic body. And part of the utility of the chills could be to remind us of the integration of all of the things that we are as human beings. And so whether it's the stimuli from nature or stimuli from some kind of spiritual, religious experience or music or other things that can be the catalyst for a chill, it does cause us to have that physiological, emotional, spiritual reaction to the complexity of who we are.
Yeah. It makes me think that maybe if like the fact that we are so surprised and curious and interested about the chills speaks to our disembodied culture, where we're no longer using our body for anything, and we've lost all our fur, we've lost a lot of our strength and agility, and lots of different things. And if we had like an early hominid, for example, on the podcast, and they would actually be surprised about the fact that we're surprised about chills, and they would just say, yeah, chills, of course, chills is this, chills, yeah, of course it is. Why are you asking all these questions about chills? And we're just doing that because we are so disembodied, and we've completely sort of, as you said, like lost touch with our body. I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but there's a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Carson, I'm wondering if it would be a good idea to provide an opportunity for our audience to experience chills by sharing videos.
Yeah, let's do that. Just be mindful of our time so we can share the video. And there was a couple questions I think Stan had asked in the chat about the notion of flourishing and chills, which is, we've been talking kind of around it and through it and kind of with it. But I thought that might be something that we could revisit on the other side of watching this video. So I'll go ahead and just take a moment and do that. Forgive me while I do this tech thing. One moment. Tom, are you guys hearing the sound?
Yeah, we need the full screen though.
Yep.
เขาจะได้อะไรถ้าเขาทำแบบนี้ทุกวันเขาจะไม่ได้อะไรเลยไม่ได้รวยขึ้นไม่ได้ออกทีวีไม่มีใครรู้จักไม่ได้มีชื่อเสียงที่มากขึ้น ราะสิ่งที่เขาได้คือได้แค่ความรู้สึกได้เห็นความสุขได้เข้าใจได้ความรักได้ในสิ่งที่เงินซื้อไม่ได้ได้โลกที่สวยงามกว่าเดิมในชีวิตคุณอะไรคือสิ่งที่คุณต้องการมากที่สุด
ไทยประกันชีวิตเชื่อในความดี
It's a great ad for a life insurance.
Yeah.
That certainly gave me chills. Tom?
I'm wiping away the tears.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely beautiful.
Right. Yeah.
Wonder if anybody else in the chat experienced that. So getting back to it then, in terms of the questions of, say, flourishing in chills, do you have any kind of last thoughts about that relationship?
So what do you mean by flourishing?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I guess that's a question. I think maybe we just watched a couple minutes of flourishing.
Oh.
So, in terms of like, what is, if any, the relationship between, say, chills and flourishing for oneself? What is, however you might define, say, flourishing? For me, I define it in the sense of, in the face of all of these questions, in the face of the unknowns that all of us face every day, every moment. And I do believe, actually, personally, this is tied to our breath, our cycle of our breath, but just my own opinion. That flourishing is an orientation towards, despite not, quote, knowing, we still choose the best, or we choose the better, for a lack of a better term. We choose, we choose life in a way that is still rich, regardless of the fact that we don't know beyond what that might be. So using that definition, which is not necessarily the best or any, it's just randomly mine, how might chills have a relationship to that?
Yeah, very interesting. It's kind of like, what's like a disposition towards uncertainty, and like connecting to, what people called faith as well, I guess. But so, yeah, I think chills in that context are interesting in many ways. Like, first, they're a reminder that there is more to our cognition than what we know, right? So the fact that these chills are surprising and they're happening to us are also kind of an indication that in some way our body has got our back, right? And that, or our body and mind, but that even though you don't know you don't know everything, including about the way we think and the way we perceive and so in the world, they're a reminder that we have these mechanisms to remind us of what is important, right? And that's, I think, important to acknowledge that. And I think it's a very positive thing, right? That no matter what, we have this, circuit that's gonna, but then, yeah, it's also, there's something deeper to be said, right? That speaks, for example, to this stimulus we just saw, reminding of what is important in life, and that we can be quick to forget, or it's like, life circumstances and culture and the things we get exposed to every day, whether through movies or in the in professional work, in the work office, or in our relationships with others and our friends and our family and so on. it takes a certain form, and then you start, getting used to it, and making these predictions and building this view of the world, right? And I think what's interesting about the chills is that it sort of erupts into this sort of like mundane, everyday perception of things to remind us that there's more to life than even like everything we can imagine, right? And it's like there's both sides, right? You have the negative and the positive chills. So it can also be like, hey, you think you're safe, but you're not, or hey, you think you're not that safe, but actually you are very safe or something. And yeah, they're an interesting signal for thinking our relationship to uncertainty, which is something like so important about, in human life, right? And especially in our time where there's so many events completely outside of our control and very uncertain, where we don't know how they will evolve, and that we're exposed to through the news and so on. And maintaining that sense of hope in the future is harder and harder at the collective and individual level. And so that we can have cultural artifacts that can leverage these like ancient biological responses to give us some sense of orientation it's extraordinary when we think about it.
It really is. I love what you just said, how your body gets your back.
Yeah.
It's great. It's awesome. Well, I think on that note, I think it's appropriate to put a bookmark here. Tom, unless you have, I apologize. I didn't mean to not give you an opportunity. If you have anything you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to wrap up today's conversation, and really appreciate Felix, you joining us and taking us on this journey of the work you've been doing for the last decade, and delighted that you're committed to continuing it, and that there are others that are inspired by the work you're doing and want to collaborate. And Carson, thank you as always for helping to put together another extraordinary week and day today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Felix, for, again, just to echo what Tom said, for taking the time to come and share your work. It's truly magnificent. So I can imagine many in the audience are probably very appreciative of you and the effort.
Thank you so much to the two of you for this beautiful conversation. And yeah, like a lot of this is not just my work, right? It's like the result of not only like many scientists who have lived before me and made all the Python library available, right? And then also my colleagues at the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Study, and friend like Abhinandan, with whom I've been doing a lot of this work for the past year. So I think it's more knowledge.
Well, you're part of a beautiful collective. So with that, we'll go ahead and start to wind down the show. As always, there is a link in the after chat that a link in the chat that Stan has provided, where you can go and to the after chat and further have a discussion. Also wanted to, again, as I've been saying, put in the blatant plug. As we'll discuss more specifically on Friday, the independent scientific research in general, and in my personal opinion, specifically around the frontier of consciousness studies, is of paramount importance to the benefit of our global society, free from the agendas and restrictions of traditional institutional-based funding mechanisms. Independent research goes really unfettered to where the science sets the direction rather than the politics or some other reason. And so the IACS, as an independent science lab, is looking to create a community of funders, individuals who are willing to support the work, so that the scientists there can show up and essentially do what they feel is best when they feel it's best to do it. And I can say from personal experience, hanging out with Felix and others at lunch, walking down the street and just listening to these guys ideate and to see where their ideas go. They need to be supported in doing that, as opposed to having to go through an extensive grant making process and so forth. And there's a need here. There's a funding gap need that needs to be filled. So if you're able, please be willing to make a tax-free US donation. You can go to advancedconsciousness.org, and there's a link there that you can do, and you could do it on a monthly subscription basis or just as a one-time thing. But I think we have to really understand that this work and this thinking and these efforts don't just happen randomly. They need to be financially supported by people who appreciate the value. So to that end, please consider doing it. Tomorrow, we will be joined by the founder of IACS and principal investigator, Dr. Nico Regente. He'll also bring on his colleague, Dr. Josh Kane, to discuss. Nico will talk in part about his concept of the qualia compass, which is just brilliant, and as well as the combined work with Dr. Kane on the neuromodulatory induction of meditative states. So it'll be a very rich conversation. So please join us then for tomorrow. And again, thank you, everybody, and we will see you down the road. Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.